Hey folks, I'm JC, and this channel is all about running great one-shot adventures, but also short campaigns. And recently, I ran a short campaign in one of my favorite RPGs, Dungeon Crawl Classics. I ran it for a group of teenagers. Most of them were familiar with D&D 5th edition, but they never played a game like DCC. And so I decided to kick off our campaign with what DCC is famous for, a funnel. An adventure that hands each of your players with 3 or 4 zero-level peasants and challenges them to survive a gauntlet of monsters, traps, and deadly, deadly surprises. I've already run a lot of DCC's best funnels like Portal Under the Stars, Hole in the Sky, and Danger from the Air, so I was in the mood for something new. And I had just picked up one of the newer funnels, Grave Robbers of Thracia, and decided to give it a go. If Grave Robbers of Thracia sounds familiar, that's because it probably is. It's a prelude to the massive Caverns of Thracia book that Goodman Games just re-released. It's a massive mega dungeon that first appeared in 1979, written by the early RPG pioneering game designer Janelle Jacques. I'm actually not super familiar with Caverns of Thracia. It was a little before my time as a gamer, but it is a dungeon that is still massively respected among RPG enthusiasts and historians for its level of detail, many twisting paths, warring factions, and so many monsters. And this companion piece, Grave Robbers of Thracia, is meant to be an introduction to that setting. So, is Grave Robbers of Thracia a good start for new Dungeon Crawl Classics players? Is it a funnel that can compete with so many other great ones, murdering dozens of adventurers while making them squeal with delight? Well, grab your favorite gong farmer friend and get ready for some pain, because not only am I going to give you a full review of Grave Robbers of Thracia, but I'm going to give you GM some tips and tricks on how to run this adventure like a pro. Before I jump into my review, I want to talk a little bit about funnels. Funnels are what I consider to be RPG adjacent. They're not quite the same as a regular RPG adventure, but they're close. Funnels are great hooks for campaigns and a lot of fun, but they tend to be less serious than a typical RPG adventure. After all, you're seeing your characters mowed down steadily over the course of a couple of hours. They tend to be shorter so as not to wear out their welcome. And to me, a great funnel has to have a variety of dangers, monsters, traps, puzzles, mishaps, etc. Because, like a good horror movie, you want your character deaths in a funnel to be memorable. I set this up because I'll be honest up front here. I think Grave Robbers of Thracia misses on a lot of these elements. But let's dive in. Grave Robbers of Thracia is written by Bob Brinkman. It's designed for about 20 hapless zero-level characters all split up among your players. It's only 12 pages long, so it's designed to run in a single session. I was able to finish it in about 3 hours, and that included teaching players rules and creating some quick characters. The adventure is set on the Isle of Thracia and is designed to be an introduction to that world, which is loosely based on Greek mythology. The setup is this. 1,000 years ago, the kingdom of Thracia fell amidst a beastman uprising. A surviving legion fled into the jungle, tasked to carry Thracia's key artifacts to safety. Most of the legion's members didn't survive the jungle's dangers, but one did. Several men who were carrying the kingdom's greatest treasure, a resurrection stone. The survivors of the legion dug an underground complex to hide the stone, and used the stone to keep themselves alive. The stone, however, had a flaw. Using it required the sacrifice of 2 other willing people to resurrect a third.
Whoa, the math here is a little hard for me. So what we're saying is my dead mate can come back to life with the resurrection stone, but only if the 2 of you give up your lives. But then, my mate can sacrifice himself with somebody else to bring one of you back to life, and then, I don't know, it just feels like a Gary Gygax Ponzi scheme.
And using this technique again and again and again over a millennia corrupted the soldiers. They were transformed into the Vriko-lackeys, these intelligent, liver-eating ghouls. And so 1,000 years later, the players are all villagers living in this jungle, and the story of the Last Legion has largely been forgotten. But their village has been haunted by sudden disappearances. People just keep vanishing in the jungle, and the players, seeing most of their village now gone, are tired of all that, so they track the lost villagers into the jungle, and they find a burial mound, which leads into a series of underground tunnels. They don't know it yet, but they've discovered the complex of the Lost Thracian Legion. This setup is fairly run-of-the-mill for a DCC funnel. Yes, players are usually villagers, and yes, their village usually gets wiped out, but other adventurers do it in either a more spectacular or gruesome fashion. Something like a giant wizard emerging from the earth and eating everybody and running off happily into the mountains.
I'm a DCC funnel bad guy dancing on your village.
Or they do it with more urgency, where there's a more clear goal. So here, because this adventure had neither of those two setups, I felt like I had to make up the names of a handful of family members that had gone missing. And I told the players that they had just had dreams and nightmares that those family members were still alive, trapped underground and screaming for help. This, I felt, gave the players much more motivation from the get-go. Otherwise, leaving an empty village behind, I just felt like the players might decide to go off in an entirely different direction. They may ignore the mound and instead head to the shore or go check out other villagers to see what had happened there. So give your players a little bit more motivation here. The underground shrine is made up of about a dozen rooms, and it's pretty straightforward. You can see here on the map how there's really only one junction, so your players are likely to explore one half of the dungeon and then the other. It's also a pretty cramped place for 20 adventurers, so I encourage GMs to be mindful of exactly how many villagers can do something at once. I was surprised for a funnel which should be designed for lots and lots of PCs, all took place in such a contained environment. So I generally never let more than 2 or 3 villagers do something at a time given the tight quarters. The Vrykolaki's ghouls ambush the players very soon after they enter the shrine. The ghouls are fairly typical ambush predators. They drop down from the ceilings to attack their prey. I was surprised that the author used the ghouls so early on versus scare the players with their presence and then hit them later on when they least expect it, like a horror movie. But no, they're really here as soon as the PCs enter the shrine. The ghouls are pretty cool though. They're covered in this weird cilia that sucks blood from their prey. And most uniquely, when the ghouls reach 0 hit points, they don't die. They just go into sort of a torpor where they're unable to be killed unless they're burned, waiting to come back to life with just a little bit of blood. This is a cool effect, but the adventure doesn't really explain how to best use it. So I made up some house rules that if a ghoul went down and somebody was injured within 10 feet of them, maybe more than 3 hit points, there was a 50-50 chance that the ghoul would get sprayed with some blood and come back to life. And this forced my players to use tactics, hit the ghouls from a distance, keep the ghouls spread out, protect their injured players and putting them to the back. This added a lot to the tactics of the game, but again, it's something I had to really add to get the feel that I think the author was going for. The rooms are fairly mundane for a dungeon. There's a spinning blade trap at the crossroads that'll probably kill 1 or 2 PCs.
Oi, follow me, mates. It's not like there's gonna be a spinning blade trap here or anything. They haven't been seen since 1987.
There's also a giant spider. The nastiest beast in the dungeon is a giant archaea, a single-celled jelly which lives in a well, bursts outwards to stick to the PCs and drain them of their blood. You know, I've always loved well monsters ever since I read the Dungeon of Dread Endless Quest book way back in the 80s. Did anyone else love those books as much as I did? I mean, they weren't as good as the fighting fantasy books, but they were still pretty good. And of course, there's more ghouls and their ghoul hounds for the PCs to deal with. I don't really have a favorite room because honestly, they're all pretty similar. And I had to really work as a GM to make them feel different. For example, there's a room with an altar in it dedicated to the Thracian god Sabazios.
Ah, great Sabazios, god of sky and steed, lord of ecstasies, and...
That's really all we know about him. He only gets a paragraph this big. He sounds pretty cool, but the room really is just a room with an altar. The adventure says that Sabazios is watching over the players in this dungeon, and as a result, they get a bonus luck point when they visit his altar. I felt like this was too subtle, and the players might miss this. So instead I had Sabazios' voice in the player's head as they entered the room, and he asked them to show their respect for him at the altar, which for my players resulted in them putting items on the altar to get that luck point, which in turn was great because it forced a hard decision for the players. These 0-level peasants, after all, only come equipped with a shovel and a chicken if they're lucky. So which one do they sacrifice? And then in the best part, one of my players actually snuck away from the group later on, and he ended up stealing all the items left behind at the altar. It was the highlight of the adventure, but you can see a lot of that was set up by me, not the adventure. And worse, Sabazios doesn't get really much of a god write-up or a patron in the adventure, so if the players are inspired to serve him, well, you're kind of on your own as a GM to figure that out. The boss of the adventure is Gallus, the chief of the Ghoul Legion. He offers the PCs to join him to gain wealth and immortality and restore the Thracian Empire. But he's really just a tougher ghoul, equipped with a mithril longsword and having 18 hit points, so he's got a little bit more than everybody else. But he really has no special abilities beyond what the other ghouls have, which was a little disappointing for a final fight. So again, I had to tweak this and add some of those captives to the room, those family members of the PCs who had stumbled into Gallus's lair and agreed or been intimidated to become his servants. So this upped the stakes a bit in the final battle, having them there. And again, this gave the PCs a reason to stick around and kill them and rescue their friends versus just hightailing it right out of there. But defeating Gallus wins the players the Resurrection Stone, which is a pretty bold choice to kick off a campaign because you just gave the players the ability to resurrect people, now at a cost of sacrificing 2 others who have to be willing. I'm not sure how this item would play out in a longer campaign, because when my players got it, we played for 3-4 more sessions and they never used it again. They just shoved it in a bag. So it wasn't actually that big of a deal. But I applaud the author for having the guts to give a bunch of 0-level players such a powerful artifact. And that's Grave Robbers of Thracia. So what do I think? I'm sad to say that I think this is one of the more disappointing DCC adventures I've run. Usually at this point in my review, I tell you my criteria for great dungeons, how they have to have an interesting mix of encounters, how the environment has to tell a story, how the dungeon has to give GMs tools to create urgency and lead the players around, and how there has to be a twist, a turn, to really make it unique and stand out from all the other fantasy dungeons out there. Unfortunately, Grave Robbers of Thracia does none of that. The encounters are straight up fights with 1 or 2 traps along the way. The dungeon doesn't give the GM any tools to create pressure, and it's just all very ordinary. There's 0 buckets of gonzo fun that DCC is known for. And I know that that's not Thracia, but the gonzo fun that I was expecting wasn't really replaced by anything curious or interesting or cool. And while the author put a lot of thinking into the entries to tell the story of the Lost Legion, the read-aloud passages I found were just way too long. And they don't really sing. There's no real poetry to them. Everything just sort of sounds alike. Wording like, the hallway opens up into a triangular chamber. Its smooth, damp stone walls converge towards a central depression filled with gently steaming water, which then goes on for another minute or so exactly like that. And even the one player handout that's given is just very dense. At least the author was very honest in his design notes and said that he's not one for brief room descriptions, and so you're getting exactly what the designer intended. And actually, let's come back to the well room. Let's sidebar for a second, okay? Okay, just so you know where I'm coming from, I do love well rooms. Recently, Ben Milton from Questing Beast put DCC and Goodman games on blast for overly long entries and old school layouts. And I'll say right now that I don't necessarily agree with him. Not every adventure needs to follow a minimalist layout, not even old school adventures. Heck, Call of Cthulhu has brilliant adventures with really long narratives, and that's almost as old as D&D. But Grave Robbers of Thracia does fall into the trap that he talked about. It's overly long read-alongs, there's parts that are difficult to tell what's critical, and none of it is especially interesting. There's no real highs and lows to get you or your players excited. So while I think the formatting here is fine, I just don't think the content lived up to what players and GMs would be expecting. Now, like I said, I never played much of Caverns of Thracia, and I do believe the author really tried to respectfully line up this adventure with that more famous one. But if this adventure is meant to be an entry into that world, I just don't think you're going to hook many players. There's just nothing unique about this adventures that are going to make your players want to move on to the bigger Caverns of Thracia set. There's no mysteries, there's no carryover characters, there's nothing just to really get them allured into this setting. And like I said, I am not super familiar with that mega dungeon at all, so just take this with a grain of salt from a newcomer. So unfortunately, I just can't really recommend Grave Robbers of Thracia. I think it pales compared to most of the other DCC funnels I've run. I think it pales compared to the other OSR funnels that I've liked, like Trial of the Slime Lord for Shadow Dark, which is a great flavorful and weird OSR dungeon, or even compared to some of the classic TSR modules that are worth visiting. I would go to one of those versus this one. The good news, however, is that I followed up on this DCC adventure with several others for my group, which they loved, and I'll be reviewing those soon. If you found this review helpful and want to see more like it, don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. And if you've played Grave Robbers of Thracia and think I've got it wrong, well, leave me a comment below. Until next time, I'm JC, and just remember, if a god asks you for a donation and all you have is a pitchfork and a chicken, be sure to leave the... Actually, I have no idea which one I would leave. I mean, I think I was a really mean GM to even give my players that choice.